$32,700, the auctioneer echoed through the Austin Cattle Exchange. Beatrice laughed, her diamond rings catching the arena lights. Consider it your contribution to the family legacy, Clara, my cousin sneered, sliding the invoice across the bidding table. Uncle Silas had lost another high-stakes card game, and I was expected to foot the bill to save their reputation in front of the wealthiest ranchers in Texas. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I did not cry. I did not ask why. I just looked at the invoice and felt the cold, familiar mechanics of a transaction I had been executing for 22 years. Since I was orphaned and taken in by my Aunt Marion and Uncle Silas, I had been the silent investor in their version of a family. My veterinary degree was merely a tool to keep their vast herds alive, a complimentary service to pad their profit margins. Meanwhile, Beatrice received the luxury vehicles, the public praise, and the spotlight. Tonight, Silas had gambled away his pride in a backroom poker game and desperately needed to purchase this exceptionally expensive bull to prove his financial liquidity to the other ranchers. He did not have the cash. I did. People often wonder why individuals subjected to systematic exploitation do not simply walk away at the first sign of abuse. It is not out of weakness or loyalty. It is the invisible chain of the survivor. When you are conditioned from childhood to believe that your only value lies in your utility to others, compliance becomes an ingrained survival strategy. You do not fight the current. You navigate it to stay afloat, quietly building your reserves. I handed over my credit card to the auction clerk because arguing in public would cost me more strategic energy than the money was worth. I swiped the card. The transaction was approved. I was analyzing the overall script of my life, decoding their manipulation as if studying File 1, Panty 2 NG, Kench Bengok, PDF. There is a specific psychological trap in cruel normalization. When abusers are never held accountable, their cruelty ceases to be an isolated event and becomes an established baseline. Silas and Marion did not see extorting my life savings as theft. They saw it as collecting rent on my very existence. In their minds, their status as my guardians granted them an infinite line of credit against my future earnings. They were not shocked by their own audacity. They were merely executing a business model they had perfected over 2 decades of unchecked power. The receipt printed with a sharp, mechanical whir. I signed my name, legally binding myself to a $32,700 deficit. Beatrice smirked, sipping her premium champagne. Warren, my cousin who never formulated an original thought in his life, chuckled quietly beside her. Marion patted my shoulder, a hollow gesture completely devoid of warmth. They expected me to lower my eyes and absorb the humiliation just like I always did. They expected this transaction to conclude, like all the others, with me quietly subsidizing their pathetic illusions of grandeur. But anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I rubbed my eyes trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't an emotional breakdown. It was a finalized balance sheet. The sum was staggering, entirely wiping out the funds I had painstakingly saved to open my own independent veterinary clinic. Yet, as I held the slip of paper, the familiar numbness faded into absolute, razor-sharp focus. I was already calculating the exact rate of interest I would charge for 22 years of uncompensated labor. My family turned back to their drinks, completely unaware that they had just finalized the very last invoice I would ever pay. Before I could place the receipt in my purse, the heavy oak doors of the VIP viewing deck swung open. The low murmur of the auction floor vanished into a suffocating silence. Great-grandmother Eleanor, the legendary founder of the ranch empire, stepped forward from the shadows of the honorary seating area. At 85, she still commanded absolute authority. Her spine was rigid, her gaze sharp enough to cut through steel. She had built this entire regional dynasty from dirt and wire, and everyone in the room knew her word was absolute law. I watched as Silas physically recoiled. Marion's confident smile collapsed into a mask of sheer panic. Eleanor walked with slow, deliberate precision until she reached our table. She did not look at me with pity. She looked at Silas with a disgust so profound it bordered on anthropological fascination. Silas, her voice cut through the quiet arena like a whip. You are a pathetic liability to this family name, Silas stammered, attempting to formulate a defense, attempting to categorize the extortion as a simple misunderstanding. Eleanor silenced him with a single raised finger. I have watched you drain the resources of this estate for years. I have watched you parade your mediocrity while Clara quietly ensured this ranch remained profitable. You thought you were demonstrating power tonight by forcing her to cover your gambling debts. Instead, you have publicly verified your complete financial incompetence. There was no dramatic screaming. There was only the precise dismantling of a fraud. Beatrice tried to intervene, attempting to utilize her usual charm. Great-grandmother, it was just a family contribution, she offered, her voice shaking. Eleanor did not even dignify Beatrice with a glance. She simply pulled a sleek mobile phone from her pocket and dialed a number. The entire VIP section listened as she bypassed pleasantries entirely. Walter, it is Eleanor. I need you at the main estate immediately. We are executing a complete restructuring of the family trust and the final will. Yes, tonight. The color completely drained from Marion's face. The inheritance they had been banking on, the empire they had been prematurely dividing among themselves, was evaporating in real time. They weren't shocked by what they'd done. They were shocked that the supreme authority had finally audited their behavior. Silas stepped forward, desperately trying to salvage his lifeline. Eleanor, please, you are not thinking clearly. You cannot rewrite the legacy over one transaction. Eleanor turned to him, her expression carved from ice. I am thinking with absolute clarity. Silas, this is not about one transaction. This is about a systemic failure of character. I will not leave the empire I built to parasites. She gestured for me to follow her. I did not hesitate. I did not look back at the people who had treated me as their personal ledger. I simply picked up my bag and walked away. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been permanently liquidated. We exited the arena together, leaving Silas, Marion, Beatrice, and Warren stranded in the epicenter of their public humiliation, entirely bankrupted of their perceived authority. As the heavy doors closed behind us, cutting off the frantic murmurs of the auction attendees, I realized the transaction I had just funded was the cheapest buyout of a toxic partnership I could have possibly engineered. The investment had yielded an immediate return. The drive back to the ancestral estate was executed in absolute silence. Once inside the sprawling study, Eleanor directed me to sit across from her massive mahogany desk. She did not offer tea or comfort. She offered data. Opening a heavy leather portfolio, she extracted a stack of financial documents and slid them toward me. I have pancreatic cancer, she stated, her tone entirely clinical. The oncologists estimate I have 3 months remaining. I have utilized the past 6 weeks to audit every operational account Silas and Marion have touched. I processed the terminal diagnosis without panic. Sadness wasn't loud. It was an analytical assessment of an impending loss. I am sorry, I said evenly. Eleanor waved the sentiment away. Do not be attentive. She tapped the top document. It was the silent regret of the guardian. For years, she confessed, she had observed their cruelty, hoping the biological ties would eventually foster genuine affection. It was a strategic error on her part. She realized that hoping for toxic people to spontaneously develop empathy is a failed investment. Her diagnosis was merely the deadline that forced the final audit. If I were to expire without intervening, Eleanor explained, her voice steady, Silas and Marion would isolate you entirely. They would leverage your veterinary license, siphon your remaining capital, and ultimately discard you when your utility expired. The world without my intervention would be a continuous, inescapable cycle of your exploitation. I looked down at the highlighted banking ledgers. The numbers documented a massive, unauthorized transfer of funds. $1,500,000. When your parents died, Eleanor continued, they left behind a premium parcel of developmental land. Silas and Marion were appointed as the temporary trustees. They secretly liquidated the asset 7 years ago. They funneled the $1.5 million through shell accounts to fund Beatrice's lifestyle, Warren's failed businesses, and their own extensive gambling debts. The betrayal did not evoke tears. It evoked an icy, structural realignment of my reality. I had been subsidizing the very people who had stolen my primary inheritance, but Eleanor was not finished. She slid a secondary file across the desk, a genetic registry for the auction. "The bull you were extorted into purchasing tonight?" she said, tapping the pedigree chart. "Review the lineage." I scanned the biological data. The genetic markers were unmistakable. The bull carried the exact royal bloodlines from the premium cattle herd my late father had painstakingly developed before his death. Silas had not just forced me to buy a random asset, he had forced me to purchase my own stolen legacy. This was the criminal twist that completely eradicated any residual familial loyalty. This wasn't merely poor financial management. It was a deliberate, calculated humiliation designed to erase my father's memory. I closed the file. There was no longer any margin for negotiation. My aunt and uncle had not just failed as guardians. They had operated as systematic thieves. "The lawyer is waiting in the library," Eleanor said. "We have an empire to secure." I stood up, my mind operating with the cold precision of a predator. The news of the billion-dollar estate restructuring hit the Texas Hill Country media networks within 48 hours. The regional agricultural community thrived on dynasty gossip, and the immediate disinheritance of Silas and Marion became the primary headline. To counteract the catastrophic damage to their reputation, Beatrice mobilized a rapid public relations offensive. She secured an interview on the most widely consumed agricultural podcast in the state, a platform reaching hundreds of thousands of ranchers and investors. I did not attempt to block the interview. I simply opened my laptop, connected the audio stream, and listened as she initiated her own execution. Beatrice utilized a carefully modulated tone, projecting the persona of a deeply wounded victim. She spoke of our shared childhood, fabricating stories of her family's endless generosity toward an ungrateful orphaned cousin. "We provided Clara with everything," Beatrice lamented to the host. "We gave her a home, an education, a family structure. To see her manipulate our dying great-grandmother into altering the trust is simply devastating." The host, an investigative journalist known for thorough financial research, did not offer the sympathetic validation Beatrice anticipated. "That is an interesting perspective, Beatrice," the host replied, the audio crisp and unforgiving. "However, my producers have obtained heavily corroborated financial records regarding the estate. Can you address the allegations that your parents liquidated a $1.5 million land asset belonging to Clara's parents and utilized those funds for your personal expenses?" The silence on the podcast stretched for 3 agonizing seconds. Beatrice possessed zero capability for strategic crisis management. Instead of issuing a non-committal legal denial, her inherent narcissism bypassed her filter entirely. Her voice spiked in pitch, the carefully constructed victim persona shattering into pure, unfiltered entitlement. "That money was compensation," Beatrice shouted into the microphone, her anger overriding any rational thought. "We earned every single cent of that $1.5 million. We had to put up with her living in our house for 22 years. She owed us that land. We completely deserved that money for raising her." I paused the recording, saving the audio file to an encrypted drive. She had just broadcast a full, uncoerced confession to a massive financial felony across a syndicated network. They weren't shocked by what they'd done. They were merely furious that the public was now auditing their accounting. Beatrice had intended to launch a smear campaign to destroy my professional veterinary reputation. Instead, she had bypassed the legal discovery process and provided the district attorney with irrefutable evidence of embezzlement. Within 20 minutes, the podcast audio went viral across every major platform. The backlash was instantaneous and mathematically devastating. Fellow ranchers, investors, and local businesses immediately severed all ties with Silas and Marion. Contracts were voided. Lines of credit were permanently suspended. I closed the browser window. I didn't need to issue a statement or defend my character. I simply watched the analytics of their destruction compound in real time. They had attempted to burn my credibility, but they had only succeeded in igniting their own funeral pyre. Beatrice's catastrophic lack of self-awareness had effectively dismantled their entire defense strategy. There would be no settlements and no negotiations. The public tribunal had already reached a verdict based entirely on her own arrogant testimony. I closed the laptop, feeling a profound sense of operational efficiency. The retaliation was fully automated now. The regional Supreme Court hearing was an exercise in absolute clinical efficiency. Silas and Marion had attempted to file a barrage of desperate lawsuits, contesting Eleanor's mental competency and alleging undue influence. Their previously aggressive legal team, however, functionally dissolved the moment Walter, our lead estate attorney, submitted the comprehensive evidence packet. It contained ironclad medical evaluations, meticulously documented financial ledgers detailing decades of embezzlement, and the viral audio file of Beatrice's unhinged podcast confession. The presiding judge required less than 45 minutes to issue a total prejudice with prejudice dismissal of all their civil claims. I sat in the front row of the gallery, my posture perfectly straight, my expression entirely impassive. I watched with analytical detachment as the judge not only validated Eleanor's newly restructured trust, but also formally referred the $1.5 million land liquidation to the district attorney for immediate criminal prosecution. Silas physically collapsed back into his heavy wooden chair, his face a portrait of sudden, crushing realization. Marion began to weep quietly into her hands, but there was zero sympathy left in the courtroom. This rapid, catastrophic collapse perfectly demonstrated the psychological illusion of power in an empty wallet. For decades, Silas, Marion, and Beatrice had operated under the absolute delusion that their superiority was an inherent biological trait. They fundamentally confused the temporary control of capital with actual personal value. But prestige that is merely leased through stolen funds is a structurally unsound asset. The moment their financial foundation was officially removed, their entire identity disintegrated. They possessed no genuine professional skills, no resilient character, and no authentic relationships to fall back on. Without Eleanor's vast resources to camouflage their incompetence, they were immediately reduced to exactly what they were: ordinary, desperate criminals. The regional empire they had leveraged for social dominance was permanently within a week. The criminal indictments for felony fraud and grand theft were officially filed. Silas and Marion were forced to quickly liquidate their remaining personal assets simply to cover their impending bail requirements and massive legal defense fees. Warren retreated into absolute cowardly obscurity, and Beatrice was publicly and ruthlessly ostracized by the very elite social circles she had once confidently commanded. Her wealthy fiancé abruptly canceled their engagement, citing the irrecoverable damage to his own family's corporate reputation. I did not visit them. I did not accept their frantic, last-minute phone calls pleading for transactional forgiveness. Vengeance wasn't a screaming match. It was the quiet, methodical enforcement of legal consequences. They were stripped of their ancestral home, their luxury vehicles, and their unearned pride. The previously untouchable family of the Texas Hill Country had been entirely erased from the regional hierarchy, leaving behind nothing but a cautionary tale of unchecked greed. The justice system had perfectly balanced the ledger, and my personal accounting was finally complete. I walked out of the courthouse and into the bright Texas sun, breathing in the unpolluted air of absolute sovereignty. There was no lingering sadness, no residual trauma to process. The transaction was over, the accounts were frozen, and the perpetrators were facing the exact arithmetic of their own decisions. My energy was now exclusively reserved for the future. Eleanor passed away peacefully exactly 2 months later, having lived precisely long enough to witness the total legal stabilization of her legacy. I executed the transfer of corporate power seamlessly, operating without hesitation. My very first operational directive as the sole executor was the immediate establishment of the Eleanor Foundation. Utilizing the recovered $1.5 million, along with substantial capital from the primary trust assets, I created a massive endowment specifically designed to provide full-ride scholarships for underprivileged, aspiring veterinary students. This was the strategic, undeniable justice of the planter. Punitive justice merely focuses on burning down the wreckage of the past, but true, sustainable victory lies in aggressively cultivating the future. I did not want my ultimate legacy to be defined solely by the financial destruction of Silas and Marion. Their rapid downfall was simply a necessary demolition required to clear the construction site. Real justice was taking the exact monetary resources they had stolen for their shallow vanity and systematically using them to build a permanent infrastructure of educational opportunity. I also successfully integrated the bull carrying my late father's royal bloodlines back into the primary breeding herd, meticulously restoring the ranch to the exact operational specifications he had envisioned before his tragic death. The sprawling pastures were thriving, the veterinary business was exceptionally profitable, and the vast estate was finally clean. Society frequently romanticizes the concept of biological family, dangerously treating it as an unbreakable, sacred contract. But letting go of a deeply toxic bloodline is the most vital, structural realignment a person can possibly undergo. I realized that my biological relatives were nothing more than a fundamentally bad investment, a sinking, depreciating asset that constantly demanded emotional capital while yielding absolutely zero returns. Cutting those toxic ties wasn't an act of cruelty. It was a necessary act of radical self-preservation. I deliberately severed the infected roots to save the healthy tree. In doing so, I finally reclaimed my own authentic, independent identity, no longer defined by my utility to parasites, but by my own inherent, immeasurable value. I was no longer the silent, transactional victim. I was the confident architect of an expanding empire. Yet, as I stand here today, looking out over the rolling green hills of the Texas plains as the sun sets, the clinical calculations fade into something much softer, much warmer. The cold anger that fueled my initial survival has completely dissolved, replaced by a profound, enduring peace. I've come to realize that holding on to deep resentment, even legally justified resentment, only keeps you permanently chained to the people who hurt you. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself completely free. I look at the young veterinary students working with the herds in the distance, their faces bright with genuine passion and limitless potential, and my heart swells with an overwhelming sense of deep gratitude. Family isn't about shared DNA or forced inherited obligations. True family is intentionally built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and unconditional support. By bravely letting go of the people who continuously diminished me, I made permanent room for a community that endlessly uplifts me. My father's dream is alive, Eleanor's legacy is forever protected, and I am finally completely home.